Welcome once again to our time of worship and devotion. I want to wish everyone a very happy new year, and I hope that everyone had a great Christmas. I know myself and my family enjoyed a great time just being together and sharing some good food and some gifts, and it was a real blessing to all of us, and I hope that experience holds for many. I would remind you once again, those of you on the call list, thank you so much for being a part of that and continuing to do it, because there are people who, unlike many of us who are watching this, they don't have a family to celebrate with. They are missing people desperately right now, and that's only going to get worse as our province enters a lockdown. So please continue to be diligent in reaching out to people, in making sure that they're okay, making sure that their needs are met, and especially if you know older people who aren't able to be as mobile as they could be, go ahead and offer to bring them a coffee or to pick up their groceries or whatever the case may be. So please continue to do that. Obviously, because of the lockdown, there will be no services. What we had been doing is watching the average in our area, and if it was greater than 35 cases in the previous week, so an average of 5 cases a day, we were canceling services, and if it was under that threshold, we would go ahead and have an in-person service. With the lockdown, that means we will not be having an in-person service. And I know, guys, that you're watching and not everyone agrees with that, especially, given that in some areas of the province, numbers are much lower. I get all that, and you're welcome. If you want to vent your frustrations, go ahead and shoot me an email or give me a phone call. But we're going to do our best to comply, and hopefully this will end quickly and we'll be back to having our somewhat regular in-person services. I do want to remind everyone, our midweek Bible study will continue to go out. We're going to do a couple of more of the Genesis classes, and then we're going to switch gears a little bit, just because that's a very long class. Like it's 60 some lessons, and so about the halfway point, we're going to take a little break and do something else for a little bit. And we'll come back to it, I promise. I know a number of you really enjoy that class. We will come back. We're just going to take a little break. I would also remind you of the ladies' Zoom class. Nita Irwin is hosting that. And if you want to be a part of it, I believe she sends out a link for the class every week with the bulletin. But if you're not seeing that, just go ahead and get in touch with me or Nita, and I'm sure we can make sure that you get that link as well. A reminder again that we do have the opportunity, if you're willing and able to prepare a short talk to help people prepare their hearts and minds for communion, you can do that. Come to the building here and I will record you just like what I'm doing now, and then we'll edit your contribution. What I would ask you to do is to prepare some thoughts for the Lord's table, and then word of prayer for everyone, and then I'll just edit that onto my lesson. So please, if you have any interest in doing that, and a couple of you have expressed interest and just haven't actually followed up with a phone call or email, so give me a call, let me know what works for you and when you're prepared. I know a couple people said, I'd like to do something, I'm working on it. So get in touch, let me know, and we'll set it up so that you can share some thoughts pertaining to the communion time, and then we'll add that to this video. I do want to make a big announcement. We're coming close to the end of 2020, and so with that comes our sort of grand total for food given to the food bank. Now, I don't know exactly what that is, but I do know it'll be over 4,500 pounds, because it already is. So I will give you the grand total on the first Sunday of 2021. But for now, I just want to acknowledge that we did a great job, especially this year when it was very much needed. Food banks all around the country are in great need. And so please, if you can contribute in any way, do that. Either if you're local here and you want to send stuff to the church and have us bring it over, we're happy to do that. Of course, if you're watching this from far away, please seek out your local food bank and see what they need. I can guarantee you they have some needs, and so there'll be something that you can do to help with that. Those are all of the announcements that I have. I would urge you at the moment, if you're using this as part of your weekly worship time, go ahead and pause this video, get ready for whatever you need to do to have communion emblems, and then we will go ahead with the Lord's table in one moment. So this morning, to prepare our hearts and minds for the Lord's table, I have to say there's this wonderful sort of coincidence that happens every year. Okay, so we as God's people, on a weekly basis, we partake of these emblems, the bread and the fruit of the vine, to remind us of our Savior's sacrifice, of the work of the cross, and of our special status because of that, and to reconsolidate our fellowship with one another, to remind us that we have all been made one by his sacrifice and by the blood that was shed. And that's a wonderful thing to memorialize every year. But we all know and often lament that most people don't acknowledge that. They don't realize what's happened. They don't understand the benefit and the impact that it should have on their lives the way that we do. However, in a few days' time, everyone is going to stop writing 2020 and they're going to begin writing 2021 in an acknowledgement of the life of Christ. And so it may seem like just a small thing, but as we think about it, in a moment, we're going to talk about the needed influence of God on the world. And that's just one small way that the world is sort of forced at this point to acknowledge that Jesus lived and died and rose again. One thing I would urge you to do is, as you make your changes, as you stop writing 2020 and start writing 2021, each time you do it, you take it as a blessing, as a small reminder that the whole world is counting from the year of our Lord. And what a blessing that is. And as I think about the influence of Jesus on my life and on the lives of the people in this congregation, it's encouraging to think of the potential influence there. What if more people all around the world truly understood what Jesus had done for them and who he was and how they needed to respond to that? And imagine the kind of world that we could live in. And so as I think about 2021, I think about that great event that we're counting from, the greatest life in all of human history. And I think about the potential there and the blessing that exists, and hopefully the opportunity that we can use to share God's love and God's truth with others, so that maybe the next time we partake of the Lord's table, there'll be one more member of the kingdom partaking along with us. I hope that's encouraging and helpful to you as we share in these emblems. Well, we are getting ready to transition from 2020 to 2021. And boy, there are a lot of people talking about the fact that maybe there's hope for 2021. Maybe things will be different. Maybe this will be a better year than the one that came before it. Well, last week, we discussed in some detail one of the key components of human nature. In fact, the very thing that makes us human, that separates us from the animals and places us in a special favored place in creation, and that is our divine nature, that we share something of the image of God, granted in a limited way. Okay, but we have many abilities and capabilities and capacities that we only possess because of the influence, the ongoing influence of God's image on humanity. Today, as we prepare to say farewell to 2020, I want to have a little bit of a tough discussion with you. I want to think about, to talk about, and to wrestle with the reality that 2021 is likely not going to be a better year than 2020. And that's because even if the coronavirus is totally removed from the equation, The real problems, the real challenges of mankind will remain. There will be wickedness. There will be dishonesty. Governments will continue to deceive and abuse and mistreat their citizens. People will rob and rape and assault and destroy one another in 2021. Resources will be wasted. Bad choices will be made. And there will still be illness. Maybe it won't be the coronavirus, but there will be other illnesses. And that may sound rather pessimistic. In fact, much of this lesson may sound that way, but I know all of these things to be true because we're human. And I know that last week we talked about the potential for mankind. And we talked about the ongoing influence of God's image on our lives. And the stories we told were encouraging and helpful, but they are standout stories. They encourage us for a reason. And that's because humans have done and will continue to do horrible things to one another. They'll continue to make mistakes. They'll continue to do the selfish thing instead of the right thing. And as we look ahead to 2021, I think it's helpful to ask, why is that? What is it about us that causes us to fail so dramatically? If we're created in God's image, and if we have the capacity for such good, why don't we see it demonstrated more often? Why are we so good at ignoring what's best about us and instead embracing those things that are negative and harmful and evil, not only for us as individuals, but to our friends and our neighbors and our family members? Why do we do the things that we shouldn't do? There are three aspects of this that I'd like to consider. I would suppose that they are elevated as we go from sort of best to worst. And so the first point that I want to make here is that we're just not able to be perfect. All right, even when we want to, even when we have all the best intentions, we just are not able to have that kind of presence of mind and that kind of self-control in every moment. We aren't able to see ahead and understand fully the consequences of all our choices. And because of all of that, we're going to mess up. And I can want to demonstrate this with you in a very, very simple way. Just think about the last time you had to use a power saw. Maybe it was a skill saw. I suppose that's what most people have in their garage. Maybe it was a reciprocating saw. Maybe it was a miter saw. But I know that whichever one it was, there were some safety devices on there. If it was a miter saw, it has a big guard that's going to come down over the blade as you raise it up so that you can't put your fingers in the moving saw blade. Right? The same is true on a skill saw. There's a guard there covering the whole blade. Why is that? If you think about the many, many factory workers who put together everything from cars to iPods and everything in between. If you walk through one of those factories, you would find all kinds of safety guardrails and barriers and all kinds of things all over the place to keep people from hurting themselves. You mean to tell me that people don't know enough, not to put their hand or arm or leg or foot or even their whole selves under a giant industrial press that they know is going to destroy everything in its path? Of course they know. They know it's dangerous. They know they shouldn't do it. And yet, we know very well that without those barriers, without those guardrails, without those blade covers in place, just due to simple negligence, complacency, laziness, People would be cutting their hands off and legs off and maiming themselves all the time. This is a powerful demonstration, guys. A powerful demonstration that, look, even when we know better, right? No one wants to put their fingers in a saw blade. No one wants to have their arm chopped off in some kind of industrial accident, right? And yet the fact that it happens just due to sheer negligence is a powerful lesson in the fact that humans, even when they know better, even when they want to do the right thing, will mess it up. And I might add that if you put instinct and desire into that equation, right, if you add something that's just a little bit tempting, it becomes that much worse. And so we're reminded by the wise man in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 18, that pride goes before a fall. And so that when we think to ourselves, well, everyone else needs that guideline, everyone else needs that barrier, but I'm too smart, I'm too good, I'm too capable, I'm not going to fall for the same thing, right? That pride will get us in trouble every time, right? My neighbor Bill, he shouldn't have a few drinks before driving, but I'm fine. I've got a big body and I can handle a few drinks. It's no problem. Our capacity for carelessness and inadvertent harm explains a large portion of human wrongdoing and wickedness. Right? We don't mean to do wrong. We don't mean to do evil. We don't mean to hurt ourselves. We don't mean to hurt anybody else. And yet we still do it. And they're largely just, we have a lapse in judgment. We could add to that, being tired, being distracted. A big one these days is sort of the crowd mentality, especially with social media. It's easy to think that you're doing the right thing because everyone's saying it's the right thing and you haven't really analyzed it carefully yourself. And so there are lots of examples that we could give in this first category of, yep, I did the wrong thing by accident. Right? I didn't intend wickedness. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. It just sort of happened because of my momentary lapse of judgment or my momentary lapse of attention. And so that's just one human frailty. One of the ways that we remove ourselves from the image of God and take one step toward the part of us that is just worthless animal. Now, if that were the end of the conversation, that would be good, but it gets a little bit worse, doesn't it? Because we all know that there are bad things that happen, there are bad things that people do not by accident. Now, before we move to that, I would just remind you, I need to make this point. It's important and it ties something biblical in that needs explanation. That when Paul says all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, it's kind of no wonder. It's no wonder that we can't be saved by keeping God's law because we can't even keep our own fingers out of a saw blade. How much more are we going to be unable to maintain a level of moral standard, the level of moral standard that God calls us to, right? And doesn't call us to, kind of do pretty good about it, but calls us to do it perfectly. Paul says in Romans chapter 8, verses 21 through 24, I want to do right, but evil lies close at hand. He says, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? And this, I think, points us to the point we've been making, okay, which is about just our lack of ability to maintain perfect concentration, to maintain perfect behavior all the time. Right? None of us is able to do that. And that does result in wrongdoing, for sure. It results in harm to ourselves and our harm to others. But Paul points to this even worse state. He says, "Wretched man that I am." I guess before we move on, we should point out a couple of other ways in which we kind of do the wrong thing by accident. One, we become highly emotional, right? Maybe we become overly empathetic and we want to forgive the wrongdoer. Maybe we become overly angry and we lash out. All right, maybe we're sad and only thinking of ourselves, and so we say something mean and hurtful to somebody else. All right, so that we can add that to these various ways that we can sort of fall into doing the wrong thing, not because we actively want to, right? I'm not going out to hurt anybody. I've just become so frustrated or so sad or so confused that I do the wrong thing, not meaning to. Now let's focus a little bit on the next step, which is doing the wrong thing not by accident. Right? But where we make plans to do the wrong, or we take an active role and we make the wrong decision consciously. How are we able to behave wickedly if we know better? We spent so much time last week talking about the goodness of man and the capacity that we have to be like God and be close to him. And yet we have the example of Adam and Eve. Eve perhaps falls into the first category. She was tricked into doing the wrong thing. Adam, however, seems to have made a conscious choice. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but he, because of whatever, he loved his wife, he wanted to be with her, he felt peer pressure because the only other human that he knows, whatever the case may be, he made a choice to eat the fruit. And we continue to make the wrong choice, don't we? And so here what we have to add is motivation, right? Perhaps the mistake that we made, we can't find any ill will in that mistake. However, there are many mistakes, many wrongs that are committed with ill will, with the knowledge that doing this is going to hurt somebody, doing this is going to be to my benefit and to someone else's detriment, and yet I'm going to do it anyway. Paul explains those who love themselves more than they care about the well-being of others, more than they care about the will of God, more than they care about human kindness and dignity, will do some pretty dastardly things. And so 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 4 says, "Understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God." Notice that the primary driving force behind this human wickedness is selfishness. I get what I want. And yeah, someone may get hurt or I may be taking it from somebody else, but as long as that doesn't really directly affect me, it's fine. We may ask, do these people feel bad? Well, yes. In fact, I would point out that much of what's going on in our society right now, much of the push for political correctness and inclusiveness and being non-judgmental is all about alleviating the guilt, the very real guilt that people feel because they know very well they're doing the wrong thing. I've had people say to me, right, I know I shouldn't engage in the behaviors I'm engaging in. I know I shouldn't be in this relationship that I'm involved in. I know that I shouldn't be conducting this kind of business practice. And it bothers them. That's why they bring it up to a preacher, but not enough to stop. And boy, they sure don't want to be reminded of it. Evan Sayet very aptly describes our society's obsession with alleviating guilt, with being non-judgmental, with being politically correct. He describes it by saying that we're trying to regurgitate the apple. And what he means by that, and I brought this up before, but I'm going to share it again because some people will have forgotten, some people maybe missed it the first time. But what he means by that is, when Adam and Eve ate the apple, they gained the knowledge of good and evil. And he says, we're trying to give up the knowledge of good and evil in an effort to regain paradise. Right? They got the knowledge of good and evil. They were kicked out of the garden. Well, maybe if we give up the knowledge of good and evil, we can regain Eden. And so the way that we've chosen to try and do this is to just pretend that everything good is, that everything evil, is actually good. Right? So you're having an illicit affair. That's fine. Don't worry about it. Human appetites are what they are. You should do what makes you happy, what makes you fulfilled. Right? Paul explains this human capacity to engage in wickedness and to become sort of progressively better at it by saying that there are some whose consciences are seared. And I would point out that they'll likely react violently, angrily to anyone who would bring up their wickedness. That's why in our society you're not supposed to bring up God publicly. You're not supposed to pray at school. Right? You're not supposed to talk about marriage between a man and a woman because someone who isn't married, right, someone who's promiscuous, is going to feel bad. The fact is, if you do the wrong thing, you should feel bad. And so everyone is quick to bring up Matthew chapter 7:1. Don't judge. But they've forgotten Romans 11:22, where Paul says, behold the kindness and severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. And so, first, we do wrong because we made a mistake. We were negligent. We weren't paying attention. Secondly, we do wrong because we're selfish. There's something in it for us. And so we give in to temptation and we do the wrong thing. Although we feel bad about it, we maybe won't do it again, or we want to try to make some kind of, reconciliation for it, but we still do it. Number 3 in this slide into the cesspool of human instinct is not when we do wrong by mistake. It's not when we do wrong because we're tempted and we kind of fell into it. It's when we do wrong and praise it. When we do wrong and call it right. When we do wrong and refuse to acknowledge the wickedness and guilt of our behavior. Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 20 describes people, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Now I might remind you, that Isaiah is written going on 3,000 years ago. So this is not a new problem for mankind. And I know it's tempting to look at our society and think, it's in such a disastrous state of affairs that it's got to be worse than it's ever been before. But this verse indicates that it isn't. In fact, Isaiah is describing the people of Israel, God's people, when he says this. And so what we're seeing here is a description of humans' capacity for wickedness when separated, when unfettered by God's guidance. Paul describes this same backward thinking and describes how it comes from not keeping God in his rightful place in our lives. Look at Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 24. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of immortal God for images, resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their heart to impurity, to dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up their natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind, to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They're gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil. Imagine, right, that the evil we already know about isn't enough. We've got to find new and more creative acts of wickedness to be satisfied. Disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. One would be hard-pressed to find a more accurate description of modern society than the one that Paul records here in Romans chapter 1, 2,000 years ago. Right? Again, it's not anything new. We're not witnessing something that has never been seen before. We would do well to consider that this is where we'll all go. Where you and I would be if we were removed, unhinged from God's influence in our lives. And so as Christians, we ought to try that much harder, right? At every opportunity, we ought to be drawing closer to him. We ought to be committing ourselves more fully to him and to his truth, knowing that every step away from that, every compromise of that is a move toward the kind of people described here in Romans chapter 1. I want to share a quote from a book that I absolutely love called The Devil's Delusion by David Berlinski. Berlinski is a Jew, works for the Discovery Institute, and has done some exceptional writing, and I would recommend you read the book, look up some of his interviews online. Very, very helpful individual. But he talks about humans when removed from the influence of God. Listen to what he says. He says, what Hitler did not believe, and what Stalin did not believe, and what Mao did not believe, and what the SS did not believe, and what the Gestapo did not believe, and what the NKVD did not believe, and what the commissaires, functionaries, swaggering executioners, Nazi doctors, Communist Party theoreticians, intellectuals, brown suits, black shirts, Gaultiers, and 1,000 party hacks did not believe was that God was watching what they were doing. He goes on to say, as far as I can tell, very few of those carrying out the horrors of the 20th century worried overmuch that God was watching what they were doing. That is, after all, the meaning of a secular society. We know and can be thankful for the truth that God created us in His image. And we know that whatever good is in us, whatever righteous compunction we have, comes as a result of the fact that we were made in the image of God. But we also know that God doesn't force us to live up to that standard. God calls us. He encourages us. He draws us, but He won't force us. And so when men reject who God made them to be and allow their baser instincts to rule, there is no limit to the depth and breadth of the wickedness that mankind is capable of. The fact is, without the ongoing influence of God in our lives, we are in a lot of trouble. And when I think of the world that my boys may face if society continues on its current trajectory, it's scarier than any nightmare. Because we know how far mankind is willing and able to go when they are left to their own devices, when God gives them up, as we read in Romans, to a debased mind. Becomes all the more important for God's influence to be expressed through us, through our lives, through our statements, through our examples. We're called, Paul says in Philippians, to shine as lights in a world of darkness. And so as we look to 2021, the most important question we can ask is not what the year will be like. It's to ask what will be like. What will we do to be a light in the darkness? What will we do to express God's influence and God's truth and to point people to that reference point that they so desperately need and without which they are lost and floundering and hopeless? Next week, just as we've considered humanity's image, humanity's creation, in the image of God, just as we've considered now humanity's struggle with their baser instincts, humanity's inability to be perfect, and ability when left unhinged from God to completely fall off the rails. Next week, we're going to ask about human responsibility. Knowing what we know about mankind, knowing what we know from both this week and last week, what are God's expectations? What should our expectations be, and who is beholden to God? So that's where we'll be going on the first Sunday of 2021. But again, for this week, I would leave you again with the reminder that this year and every year, what matters is what we're going to be like, not what the future holds. Because whatever that is, our calling is the same.